Nihilism is both blessed and cursed with being an anti-ideology, first and foremost, and not an ideology unto itself. So it's both an advantage and a disadvantage. That by and large, when people discover nihilism, I can't say they convert to nihilism, they don't become filled with this enthusiasm. They don't become obsessed with the notion that they have to go around convincing everyone else that they also ought to be nihilists. They don't come on the internet passionate about disputing the correct definition of nihilism. And this is quite a contrast to just about every other ideology you can Google in the 21st century. To ask you in the audience to have a little bit of sympathy for the position of a nihilist, someone who really positively identifies with the term nihilist, and someone who does take the time to explain to his loved ones, friends and family, and people who want to listen to the internet, what nihilism means to me and why I think it might matter in your life, yours, and yours, not everyone in the audience, but at least some of you. Two really brief anecdotes. One is, yesterday, someone wrote to me, basically hate mail, a critique or harsh condemnation of my channel, and it concluded by saying, I don't think that you can reach the people you'd like to by telling them that everything they know and love is wrong. And I posted this to the internet because I encourage criticism. I wanted my other viewers to read this criticism. But I added the footnote at that point. It is very much the core message of my YouTube channel. Like you could say it's like my mission in life in many ways, is precisely to reach out to people and tell them that everything they know and love is wrong. If you can't sympathize with that, about 3 years ago, there was a short video that went viral on the internet, and it was taken by a woman who was wearing the full Muslim prayer garb that covers everything but her eyes. And she was at some kind of religious ceremony or event where all these other people were freaking out and, enjoying the Holy Spirit, were caught up in the rapture of this religious event. She moved her camera around like this, showing the crowd of all these other people in full traditional Muslim garb. And there was a caption basically just saying, look, I'm the only atheist here. Like, how do you think I feel? Like, how do you think I feel being in a society or being in this particular ceremony where everyone is motivated by and swept up in this ideology that I regard as bad and evil and wrong? Now, it is worthwhile to reflect, for me and for you in the audience, how would my life be different if I were born and raised in Saudi Arabia? How would my life be different if I were born and raised even in Thailand? If I were spending my time really in a kind of fierce opposition to the ideology of a profoundly Muslim society or a profoundly Buddhist society, it would be a very different struggle, right? But in this society here and now, even though the alienation may not be as obvious to you in the audience, I really do live with that kind of alienation from my society. I really do live in that kind of constant state of nihilistic opposition. Now, it's true that nihilism goes beyond atheism. Nihilism goes beyond the rejection of any particular religion or the rejection of all religion in some. But nevertheless, I think that anecdote, it's a good way to reach out to people and say, look, can't you sympathize with the position I'm in? And yes, on matters both trivial and profound, and when I'm talking to people, my own mother, my own closest friends and colleagues, very often, whether I'm polite or impolite, whether I'm flattering or confrontational, actually what I'm trying to get across to them is that everything they know and love is wrong. And if you have friends or relatives who are Muslim or Mormon or Orthodox Jews, you also may have this experience. And whether or not I'm compassionate or whether or not I'm well-spoken or charismatic in getting that across, that actually is the fundamental situation. Right or wrong, that's my struggle, right? So let's be honest about that. Let's be honest about that as nihilists. And if you people are ideologues, why don't you be honest about it in terms of your own ideology? Most people who encounter nihilism, personally, subjectively, individually, do encounter it as a liberating ethic, as a liberating new approach to how to think about their own lives in the world. I saw a kind of tragicomic example of this here on YouTube. There was a YouTuber who was a left-wing anarchist or anarcho-communist. And like a lot of those people, he spent most of his time defending the ideology I can't even say really discussing philosophy. It's really about defending your own ego, in as much your ego is attached to this abstract word. And then someone else says, oh, well, if your name is attached to communism, communism killed millions of people. And then they want to defend the word and the concept of communism. Oh, no, you didn't define this word correctly, I did. And again, as I said at the opening of this video, it's both a blessing and a curse for nihilists that by and large, most nihilists, once they kind of get the message of nihilism, they don't spend their time. They don't even spend their time doing academic debates at universities about like what's the correct definition of nihilism. Whereas, whether you're a communist or a Catholic, you spend your whole life trying to define this ideology and try to redefine the terms and re-examine the history and examine your own human heart and examine the sacred text. The ideology can never be pure enough, and you yourself can never be pure enough in the eyes of the ideology. This becomes your lifelong burden. Most nihilists kind of respond to this being like, oh, okay, I get it. That's not the meaning of life. I have to actually direct all my focus and energy to me leading a meaningful life. And my meaningful life is going to be about me and what I can do. It's not going to be about my life being in service to a church or a political party, or what's much more slippery, it's not going to be in service to an abstract idea like God itself or Catholicism itself or communism itself or what have you. There was this YouTuber, and he used to be a left-wing anarchist, and suddenly, in his relatively old age, he discovered the philosophy of Max Stirner. So Max Stirner, for many people, is kind of a gateway to nihilism. And he had this epiphany. He had this sudden realization that the point of life is not coming on the internet and defending and contesting these political ideologies. He came to the conclusion that what really matters in life is how you live it. As he put it, daily practice, what you actually do with your day, he suddenly realized really matters. And being in touch with your own creative nothingness, where he's basically directly borrowing Max Stirner as transcendental. Like, he realized that what he really wants to do is be a creative, highly motivated person who's making the most out of every day and making the most out of the next 5 years of his life, that he has to work on leading a meaningful life himself and a productive and creative life, a unique life. It's a real Stirner term, putting a lot of emphasis on your uniqueness, right? And that really, he had been completely wrong for the last several years of living his life in service to these ideologies, okay? Now, as I say, it was kind of tragicomic. If you know the philosophy of Max Stirner, watching that particular YouTube video, I have to admit, was kind of laugh out loud funny. But nevertheless, I mean, this is also an anecdote that illustrates the blessing and the curse of what nihilism is for people, I think kind of both subjectively and objectively. Okay? So I'm going to run down here what I think is most important about the universal definition of nihilism. What nihilism means in each and every case for all of us, regardless of the particular ideology it's negating. More on that in just a second. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about the subjective reality, which is what most of us care about. It gets short shrift in this video because I don't want the video to be too long, okay? And you may ask, how is it possible there's something universal about nihilism? Isn't it just the case that some people living under communism in the Soviet Union negated communism? They rejected communism. They were critics of communism. They discarded communism. And then they took the next step of kind of discarding all ideology. And then that became one form of nihilism. And meanwhile, in the Muslim world, some people are going to reject Islam. In the Hindu world, some people are going to reject Hinduism and take that next step. So it's not just the critique of a particular belief, but is the critique and rejection of all beliefs. Why would that lead to something universal? I think it does. And I think it does in the same sense that the numeral 0 is universal. Regardless of the language you speak, every language in the world has to have a word for 0, no matter how the concept of 0 was discovered or how it may be written in different notation systems, different languages. It's written differently in Chinese than it is in English, so on and so forth. Still, if there's one thing we have in common, it's nothing. The 0 that's at the base of nihilism, both as anti-ideology and as a positive ideology, I think it is something universal, even though people discover it in different ways and do different things. Okay? Nihilism of one kind or another, and I'm reading text here, which is rare on my channel. Nihilism of one kind or another can arise at any time in any historical context. However, the setting that nihilism arises from will give it distinctive features, both as a private personal philosophy and on a larger scale that it might operate on. So, for example, nihilism could operate on the larger scale of a group of authors, a group of artists, could be 15 people, but it could also be a political movement. It could also be an organization that's trying to destroy the Catholic Church. It could be a specific negating political, social, religious mission that's on in a different context. But obviously, it could just be one person alone reading Max Stirner, one person with a YouTube channel. It's easy to imagine that someone who rejects Hinduism ends up discovering nihilism only to articulate a philosophy that's completely different from someone who grew up in Eastern Europe before 1989 and who was primarily concerned with the critique of totalitarian political ideology in their own process of discovering nihilism. All right? In these first few words, we've hinted that there's something worth explaining here. What do we mean in assuming that there is one thing called nihilism? And different people can discover this one universal thing in different cultural contexts independently, regardless of the particular set of ideologies or beliefs that they're negating. Then, moreover, what do we mean by saying that nihilism can nevertheless be significantly different in different times, in different social settings? All right? And then we have to ask the question of whether or not it's useful to speak of new nihilism in contrast to old, and perhaps your nihilism in contrast to mine. Right? Subjectively, the experience of nihilism is a critique of belief that goes beyond complaining about a particular ideology or belief system to ultimately reject belief as such. The opposite position commonly espoused in American culture is that belief itself is virtuous, and that being a believer is an important part of being a virtuous person, even if people disagree on the particular beliefs. In this sense, a Catholic can approve of the faith of a Hindu, even though they believe in different things, because they recognize common elements of belief. And this is very common if you study religion or know religious people. It's very common to meet someone who will tell you that even though they personally are a Catholic or a Lutheran, whatever their religion is, that they can still recognize the validity of what Muslims are doing or Hindus are doing, some rival group, because they recognize that prayer is still prayer. Some abstract notion that they still recognize that this people in a rival religion, they are in some sense abasing themselves before a superior being. They'll articulate to you what they feel all religions have in common, or at least 2 or 3 religions have in common, right? And they will affirm that faith is something they value about being a good person themselves, and then they can discern that in someone else. I don't know how many Christians can recognize that in communists, or vice versa. So it doesn't bridge across all ideological gaps. But nevertheless, the common delusion that faith is virtue, or even that all virtue relies on and derives from faith. This binds these things together in one category, right? So Catholics, Hindus, communists, they hallow a similar process of thinking. They have a parallel sense of sacredness, self-sacrifice, prayer, purity. They hone their minds in a similar way, even though they do not worship the same gods and they do not recognize the same legends, revelations, miracles, rituals, and so on when looking at the religions in detail. The good Hindu may easily praise the Catholic for being a believer, and in doing so, the Hindu approves of himself also as a believer. The positive value of belief is upheld as something unrelated to the particular thing being believed in. Right? So the subjective experience of nihilism results from the rejection of these assumptions. Belief ceases to be a virtue. That's what I'm asserting here as the universal 0 point of what all forms of nihilism, new and old, yours and mine, anti-clerical and anti-communist, what all forms of nihilism have in common. All right? The process of training oneself to live in a state of pious ignorance becomes suspect or even loathsome once you have rejected this assumption that believing is virtuous. The enthusiasm for sacred concepts or even sacred people that believers train themselves to feel starts to seem childish or insane from the perspective of a nihilist. Whether we regard this new attitude as shallow or profound is immaterial. My point here is that it has implications far beyond the critique of any particular religion or any particular ideology. With this change accomplished, a nihilist could not possibly reject the Catholic faith to then accept the Hindu faith. And this is an important point. It's not just that you're rejecting communism in order to sign up with another similar competing political ideology. It's not just that you're rejecting Christianity to convert to Hinduism, because this is a very fundamental rejection of faith, belief, and the training of the mind that's associated with those virtues over time. The way of thinking, the way of living, the way of acting that derives from, ultimately those habits of mind that do include prayer and numerous other expressions. I mean, indeed, even when you talk to communists, the extent to which some things are thinkable and others are unthinkable, the way in which they really embody their beliefs and live with the tenets of communism as a kind of faith. If you spend time around communists, that also will soon enough become clear. Okay. Does it matter that there's a difference between old nihilism and new, your nihilism and mine? Yes, but I think to a limited extent. I have spoken to nihilists on the internet who said to me, and I immediately understood what they meant, that they identified as a cosmological nihilist. They look at the universe, they look at biology, they look at evolution, they look at geological time, how many millions of years have passed just to create a rock that's lying on the ground, and they evaluate human life, belief, ideology in that context, and then find human ideologies to be ridiculous. That for them is the way they entered into nihilism. And it's worth pointing out that is a perspective that's very easy to gain today in the year 2020. It was much harder to gain that cosmological perspective in 1920. It required real brilliance and independent research to gain that perspective in 1820. And a very, very few people on the leading edge of science, people who were aristocrats, could have had that view of the world in 1720. Now, when we go back to 1520, 1420, maybe it becomes entirely impossible, right? So it's just worth noting, yes, this is profoundly conditioned by the historical and social setting you're living in, right? So cosmological nihilism is a new type of nihilism, or relatively new type. It's probably the last 100 years people have increasingly felt this way, and indirectly, the discovery of the atom bomb, the discovery of DNA, many of these things will contribute to that, okay? Now, my version of nihilism, I instead describe as historical nihilism, that when you study and learn from the history of the world, including Thucydides in ancient Greece, including the failure of communism in Europe, the failure of communism in China, and so on, I think that out of an understanding of human nature and real-world history as a process, I come to, again, the same conclusion. I do think there's this one universal notion of what nihilism is. I come to the conclusion that faith is not a virtue, that believing is not virtuous, and I step beyond the critique of particular beliefs to reject all beliefs entirely, right? And then the question remains, how much common ground is there? How much potential is there for cooperation between people who are, in this sense, members of different schools of thought within nihilism? I can't even say within. It's not like there's a tent we're all standing under, right? We're all mutually alienated, but we share to some extent this experience. We share some kind of negation of ideology leading up to this realization and taking on this perspective of the world. And again, it's both the strength and the weakness of nihilism that most people respond to this discovery not by trying to convert others to nihilism, but asking, how do I lead a meaningful life now? Now that I have to look within myself for the resources, the motivation, the direction, that I have to make my own path. I'm no longer looking in the sky. I'm no longer looking above me, whether to a literal God or to abstract concepts or even to books, ideology that's come before. I realize that it's my creative burden in life to decide to what a meaningful life is going to be, to do the work, to create it for myself, ex nihilo, out of my own creative nothingness, as Max Stirner would say. And I think each of us correctly feels that in that mission and in that challenge, we are profoundly alone. I think there's some potential, especially with the ease of association of the internet, for nihilists to discover what it is they have in common. And perhaps there's an even greater potential for us to learn from our mutual alienation. I would love to have a conversation with someone who grew up in a communist country like Laos or Cambodia and hear them talk about how maybe when they were a teenager, they started questioning what the Communist Party was telling them and how they emerged from that ideology and how they view the history of the Communist Party now as opposed to what they were taught in school. I would love to hear that. I would love to hear a nihilist perspective on growing up in Cambodia or Laos. And I defy you. I think today that story is not told on any YouTube channel. I don't think it's told on any website. I don't know if it's told in any book, right? And you could then fill in the list with a whole lot of other ideologies, including even anarchism, including even feminism. I would love to hear a nihilist perspective from someone who used to be a true believer in third wave feminism and then got disillusioned with that and moved on to a critique of belief in nihilism. Even if it's just learning from the alienness of our respective experiences, I think that could be something tremendously powerful and tremendously meaningful now in the 21st century.